Thank you for joining us today. Today we're having a workshop that is led by Dr. Jacob Kirksey. He's the assistant professor in educational psychology, leadership, and counseling in the TTU College of Education. And he has really interesting research on education policy and how he's going to kind of talk through some of the ways that it intersects with other possibly other disciplines and things like that. I'll kind of hand it over to him and let him do his thing.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here presenting as part of True Transformers. And I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about what educational policy research is and what it looks like. So in today's workshop, we're going to talk about generally what education policy research is, what it looks like, and start to begin some discussions about how you can participate in education policy research at the undergraduate level. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology, Leadership, and Counseling, and my focus is researching education policy. So what we're going to talk about in today's workshop is we're going to start out by talking about what education policy is and give it a few working definitions. Then we will launch into talking about different forms of educational research and what it looks like, paired with a discussion about data and the implications that the type of data have for how we approach educational policy research. We'll introduce a little bit of the research tools that I use in my own research and tools that you may be exposed to if you were to participate in education policy research. And finally, end with a discussion about the importance of cause and effect when thinking about education policy. At the end of the lecture, hopefully what you will be able to do is generate examples of education policy research, list some challenges that come with researching in the social sciences in general, thinking about us researching human beings and the challenges that that presents. We're trying to, talk about cause and effect. And finally, I want you all to be able to describe the purpose of the tools needed to conduct this research. But first, before we get into any of that, I often find myself wondering when I'm in any sort of workshop, especially workshops that may be outside of my discipline, why should I even care what's being talked about, right? So I'm going to spend this first bit of the presentation talking to you about why you should care about what education policy research is and why you might be interested in partaking. Now, probably most of you are too young to remember the time when Lubbock had red light cameras, this big rollout of red light cameras at all the major intersections in the city. Now, I'm from Lubbock. I left for 10 years for undergrad and grad school, and now have the pleasure of coming back as a professor now. And so when I think about some of these micro policies, these policies that happen at the local government level, right, I kind of chuckle to myself because I think, wow, if only the city of Lubbock had thought about some of the things that I think about in my own research before enacting policies like red light cameras, we might be able to avoid some of the problems that these policies cause. Now, for those who don't remember or have never heard of what happened when Lubbock decided to roll out red light cameras, let's first start out by remembering that the whole aim of the policy, and this is generally true when we talk about policies in their creation and implementation, they begin with good intentions, right? So the whole point of the red light camera policy in Lubbock is that we wanted to reduce the number of accidents that were occurring because people were running red lights, right? And so by putting up red light cameras, we would be able to, disincentivize perhaps people from wanting to run red lights, knowing that if they did, they would likely get a ticket in the mail. And the target population of this policy, whenever we think about a policy, it's very important that we think about who is the intended audience of that policy, who is that policy intended to impact. Obviously, for this red light camera example, it would be those intentional red light runners, right? And a key aspect of the mechanisms underlying the policy that made it so attractive at the beginning is this was a very efficient way to automate the process of issuing tickets, right? Which could lead to greater funds for the local government, more time for law enforcement to partake in other duties, But oftentimes, those are the only two considerations we take into account when we think about passing a policy. We don't really spend much time thinking about who else could be impacted by red light cameras. So if you are going to understand anything about education policy, I need to introduce you to one person when it comes to understanding how the red light camera policy in Lubbock could have been better conceived. And that is my grandfather, Albert Smith. Now, what you need to know about Albert Smith is he was deputy sheriff of the county of Lubbock. He drives this nice little Buick, which barely drove at all, actually. And he's just an all around, great grandfather. Goes to the grocery store and goes to get his haircut. That's about all the time he spends in the car, right? Now, Albert Smith, resident of Lubbock, right, was impacted by this policy. And we did not often think about people like Albert Smith, who was known to have a pretty heavy foot when it came to driving around the city of Lubbock, did not want to violate the law whatsoever. And so we kind of violate the idea that the policy is only impacting the intentional red light runners when we don't think about unintended consequences for other populations like Albert Smith, right? And so because we didn't think about this unintended consequence or other people who could have been impacted by a policy, in Lubbock, we saw a record number of accidents jump to 50%, right, of what they were before at intersections using these red light cameras. Now, if we think about unintended consequences and populations that are often left out of discussion when it comes to a particular policy or decision, we get very quickly to the ripple effects in education policy and an understanding about how education policy can have effects beyond its intended scope. You may have heard of the term a treatment effect, which is the intended effect that a policy should have on a particular population, right? Versus a null effect, or that it didn't have any effect at all. But you often don't hear much about populations that occur on the fringe, or unintended consequences as a result of not considering those populations in these policy discussions. Now, this is the perspective I bring to a lot of my research. And my research, and what's cool about education policy in general, is there's a lot of humans and partners involved, right? And so I've had the privilege of working with a variety of different partners at all levels of policymaking, including current Vice President Kamala Harris, to the district level, Lubbock ISD, Midland Ector County ISD, the Department of Education in California, Texas Education Agency here in Texas, as well as different nonprofits and private foundations. This is one of the most attractive features of doing education policy research, is we get to be on the front end of thinking about the real consumers of educational research and how it affects their decisions and their incentives to make policies and decisions that affect the lives of students. Now, before I get into more discussion about what education policy is, I think it would be helpful to maybe learn about some of the different research interests that I bring to education policy, because pretty soon I'm going to be asking you all to actually think about policies that you're interested in, or topics in education that motivate you in these discussions. In my research, I look at a variety of different populations, including students who are frequently not in school, students with disabilities, and students who are subject to the impacts of immigration enforcement. And then transcending all of these populations, I'm really interested in ways in which teachers, both thinking about teacher preparation and pre-service, as well as ways that we can better support teachers in service, can be helpful in supporting these different student subgroups. And I'm really interested in how these students are performing in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But enough about me. Let's talk more generally about what education policy is and what educational policy research looks like. Education policy spans a variety of disciplines and includes a multitude of topics, including standardized testing, school choice, finance, equity, reform, teachers, and there are a variety of different stakeholders involved with education policy discussions. These include policymakers, politicians, public opinion, right? So thinking about voters, and special interest groups. All of these stakeholders in some way or another are involved in education policy. And so as researchers, it's important for us to think about how education policies and decisions occur at different levels of government. They occur at the federal level, they occur at the state level, they occur even at the district level, and even within a school. And all of these different levels of educational governance, policies, decisions, and as a result, research can occur. And this isn't just a K through 12 talk. Education policy is more than just K through 12. Education policy occurs at all sorts of organizations, including here at Texas Tech and higher education institutions more broadly. So what I'd like us to do now is I'd like us to take a second and stop to engage in an activity, just so that you have something that you can carry with you through the rest of the talk. I'd like you to visit this Education Next poll, which displays public opinions about a variety of different questions related to education policy. And so I'd like you to think to yourself as you are navigating this poll and choose a particular topic that you find interesting. Do a majority of Americans support or oppose the particular question that you're looking at in the poll? Do you think research could convince someone to change their mind about this topic? And if so, what type of research do you think would be most convincing? Think to yourself, if you have a very strong opinion about one of these topics, would research be convincing to you? And if so, what type of evidence or what type of research would you need to change your mind? Great. Now that you've had a chance to think about a particular topic that you find interesting and look at some of the trends and data about public opinion of that topic, let's now discuss different forms of education research. This is really relevant for those of you considering whether or not you feel like it would be interesting to start conducting undergraduate research in the field of education policy. When we think about educational research, there's a variety of different things that we can do to produce evidence to convince someone of a particular policy is a good idea or to make a particular decision, right? We can conduct interviews and focus groups, or in other words, simply have conversations with those on the ground about whether a particular policy is a good idea. Is it working for those policies that are already in place? And should the policy continue? These can be not only just one-on-one conversations with someone like a teacher or a superintendent or a state policymaker, it can also be with groups of individuals via focus groups. You can also conduct a survey. Especially with technology these days, it's really easy to get a lot of responses to surveys and asking folks to simply respond to the same types of questions. Do we think a particular policy is a good idea? Or just more largely talk about certain impacts that education is having on that particular population, or ways in which we want to examine trends between a particular intervention we care about, a particular policy we care about, and associated outcomes with those policies. You can also observe what's going on around you. So in educational research, think about the opportunity to go into a classroom, right? To observe how a particular curriculum is being implemented, or to observe how a piece of technology is or is not supporting learning outcomes for students. These observations are particularly important for pilot studies and educational policies that are really relevant with respect to fidelity with implementation and understanding whether or not it might scale to a larger population. And then also, there's existing data that we have at our disposal. I have floppy disks up here. This is actually, if you're curious, not floppy disks. I don't know if floppy disks are even made anymore, but these are coasters. But this is the closest thing I could find to a current floppy disk, which is to refer to the amount of existing data that we have to our disposal. And the floppy disk is simply to indicate that we've been collecting data for decades. And so when we think about doing research with existing data, we can answer questions that we had many years ago, right? Or use historic trends to evaluate particular policies over time. These are the different ways in which, in different forms, that educational research can be conducted and you might consider as part of education policy research. Now, I'm going to now focus much more narrowly on the types of tools and data that I use to look at particular policies and decisions. So now we're going to talk a little bit about research tools and data that are available for advanced quantitative methods, which is my particular area of focus. Now more than ever before, we are collecting, as I get out of the way here, we are collecting data on students, their families, parents, teachers, schools, institutions of higher education, and different organizations more than ever before. We have a lot of data at our disposal, and largely this has been an advancement and an innovation due to heightened technology and techniques that we have at our disposal to examine these data. And so when we think about big data, we're simply not talking about having hundreds of students that we are trying to understand if a particular policy or decision had an impact on them. We are talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of students that could be impacted by a policy, which is very important when we start to think about how policy at the highest levels can have ripple effects and really overarching impacts for huge subsets of the country and the world. Now, when we think about data, I like to always point everyone to what data really can look like. And we are usually most familiar with Excel, right? We all took introduction to Microsoft Word, or maybe I'm too old for that. But we're very familiar with these types of data and what they can look like in an Excel spreadsheet, right? And so what I'm showing you right here is simply data that is from teachers in a particular school district that has information about their race and ethnicity, as well as the different certifications that these teachers have to be teaching. And so as a researcher, you may have questions about, are there certain types of licenses that relate to having better outcomes for students? Or in other words, is the way that we're preparing teachers somehow related to the quality that they bring into the classroom that is then associated with learning gains and outcomes for their students? And so when you ask questions like that, you really begin with data that look exactly like this. But this isn't really the big data that I was talking about earlier. When we get into the millions of observations, right, we are no longer relegating ourselves to simply evaluating trends with Excel pivot tables and graphs. We have much more advanced tools at our disposal. And one of these tools that we will look at in the next workshop for this education policy research group is Stata. Stata is a statistical programming software that allows us to look at large amounts of data and both describe the data with numbers, but also look at data via visualizations. And this can be really helpful, right? When thinking about, we had those Excel sheets and we know that Excel comes with certain limitations, but we need to pair that data with other forms of data as well, being able to merge it together. And this becomes a lot easier when we think about software like Stata and what those software can bring to us in terms of tools. And so what now you're looking at is that previous teacher data I was showing you earlier. It's actually on the end, so over there in this data set. And now we've linked that data to all of these student data and information, including student grades in the course, the years that we're observing, all the different course IDs. So if we're interested in particular effectiveness for teachers in Algebra 1 classes, we can answer questions about that. And having data stored in Stata then allows us to produce visuals like this, where we can look at descriptive statistics with bar graphs or histograms or line graphs. And we can also plot predictions for how two variables move together in thinking about something like how age might relate to someone's overall reading ability. These types of visualizations are really easy for us to do with just a matter of a few steps in learning some statistical syntax in the software. Now that we've talked about what education policy is and what it looks like, the types of educational research that can be done using different methods, and ultimately what the data looks like when we actually conduct that research, let's talk a little bit about the importance of thinking about cause and effect. One topic that is particularly important to me and definitely harkens back to our initial anecdote of Albert Smith and the Lubbock red light cameras. Cause and effect is really important in thinking about education policy because at the end of the day, what do we care about? Why even enact education policy? Sounds like an existential question, but sometimes it's really helpful just to take a step back and think about why we have policy in the first place. Well, we want to affect some sort of change, right? If everything was fine just as it was, then we wouldn't need any sort of changes to policy. We wouldn't need to enact new policies. So the idea is first and foremost, we want to be able to affect some sort of change from the outside. And by the outside, we're simply saying, if you think about we want to impact a student in a school, right? A policy can happen from the outside to change that student's trajectory within the school. We also want to know how much we want to affect that student, right? Or that teacher or that organization. We want to be able to control exactly how much of an effect we have with a particular policy. And finally, we really want to understand exactly who is being affected by education policy, right? Is it more than just the intended scope of the policy or the intended audience who is being affected? Or are there other populations outside the intended scope of the policy that could have also been affected, or more importantly, should have been considered to support the longevity and the ultimate impacts of the policy, both now and years down the road? And another reason it's important to think about cause and effect is if we don't think about isolating a causal pathway between a particular policy and the true effect that that policy has on a student or on an organization, we can often find ourselves getting caught up in spurious correlations. This graph is simply showing you X and Y, which is no longer an education policy and a particular outcome, but instead the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and the correlation with the number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in. I'm not sure what your opinions are of Nicolas Cage, but this seems to suggest that there is a strong correlation between these two variables. Similarly, thinking about per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Again, I don't tend to think about these two things as going together, but they do appear to have some correlation. Divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. Now, maybe we could try to think about why these two variables might have some sort of relationship, but it is probably the case that we are simply observing just by chance a correlation that exists, and there is not a cause and effect relationship between these two variables. And lastly, letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee and the number of people killed by venomous spiders that year. A strong correlation, but perhaps not exactly a cause and effect relationship. And there's many reasons why you can observe these types of correlations, right? Oftentimes in education research, especially when you think about we are researching humans and human behavior is often very hard to predict, it can be the case that it's not exactly X, which I'm just going to refer to now as the key policy or intervention that we care about, right? That we want to observe whether or not it's having an effect on a particular outcome. Maybe it's not X that is causing Y. Maybe it's Y that's causing X. Maybe there was something else that was happening that we observed to be an outcome that necessitated a particular policy going into place. Or, as I often refer to it as this nasty Z variable, maybe X is correlated with something else that appears to be strongly correlated with the outcome, right? Is there some unobserved factor or selection bias that we think X is predicting, and that factor is in fact predicting Y? So a really good example of this is thinking about this little fun cartoon graphic about a kid complaining that he really wishes that they didn't turn on the seatbelt sign in the plane because every single time the seatbelt sign is turned on, it gets bumpy. This would be a really great example of Y causing X, right? It's not exactly the seatbelt sign that is causing the bumpiness, but the seatbelt sign or the bumpiness is necessitating, or I guess in this case, it would be the anticipated wind that's coming. I'm not also a meteorologist or a pilot for that matter. So I'm testing my limits here in my knowledge of planes and wind and weather, but there is some other factor that is likely relating to the seatbelt sign being turned on. And the only way for us to, if we really step back for a second and think about what is cause and effect, and how can we as researchers truly know what the effect of a particular policy is, we would need this ideal setup. In the perfect experiment, right, we would be giving the same person the treatment and the control, or the policy and not the policy, at the exact same time. Or, in fact, what's better, we should give it to the whole world at the exact same time, both the policy and not the policy. And look at what happens to our outcome, right? Let's say reading scores, and let's say the policy is a reading curriculum, right? And look at the difference in reading scores when you receive the reading curriculum and when you don't. But this is impossible, right? We know that you can't implement a policy and not implement a policy at the exact same time for the exact same population, right? This is effectively saying we're cloning ourselves and one of us is getting the treatment and one of us is getting the control. And the difference in our outcomes would be the true causal effect. And because we can't do this, we have to be more creative in the methods and tools at our disposal to be able to elicit the causal effect of a particular policy or decision. This is known as accounting for selection bias. And so when we think about researching with humans, one of the things that has to come to mind is that humans often mess up a perfectly randomized experiment, right? When we randomize everything, we essentially are getting at any kind of error being totally up to chance, right? If we can take half the world and the other half of the world totally selected at random and give half of them policy and half of them not, we're getting pretty close to being able to understand what the true causal effect of a particular policy or decision is. But the fact is, that's not how policies work. When policies are intended to affect human beings, there's many different factors that come into play that can mess up our identification of what the causal effect of the policy is, right? If we think about participants and those who are not participating in a particular policy, these participants at the school level could be students who need a particular reading curriculum the most, right? Students who are from low-income households, students, if it's a reading curriculum, who are already struggling with reading. Schools may want to assign that curriculum to those students if they assume that the curriculum is going to be beneficial. And the problem with this is that when schools then have decisions about whether to assign a curriculum or not, we start to introduce selection bias into the experiment or the quasi-experiment here. So let's take an example. Let's say we want to know the impact that pre-K has on a kindergartner's reading achievement. So you go to pre-K, and we're going to compare those who go to pre-K to those who don't go to pre-K. Once they get into kindergarten, we're going to look to see who has the higher reading score. There are many other factors that relate to reading scores and whether or not somebody goes to pre-K that could bias these estimates, right? One big one that comes to mind is thinking about the money that a particular household has at their disposal to afford pre-K, right? Pre-K is expensive. It costs money to be able to send your kid to pre-K, right? And if you don't have that much money, right, then it takes a lot more effort and for you to be more creative about how you're going to support your child's development, either in the home or at other relatives' homes while parents work. And all of these factors also relate to that child's kindergarten reading achievement, right? So if money is really important about to send your kid to pre-K, money also probably relates to several other factors that also relate to your child's reading achievement in kindergarten. For example, the number of books that a kid has at home, the number of supplemental educational resources that are kept in the home, the discretionary time that parents may have to spend with their child reading to them at night, right? Or simply the parental knowledge and parents' education to know that supporting your child's early development could be really important to their later success in formal schooling. And so really, if we just take pre-Kers and not pre-Kers, and we look at them in kindergarten and compare their reading achievement, right? We may find that, yeah, those who went to pre-K have a lot higher achievement than those who didn't go to pre-K, right? But are we really picking up on the effect of pre-K? Or could we be picking up on the effect that income and general resources have on reading achievement? Is it pre-K that's correlating with achievement? Or is this one of those spurious correlations that is being driven heavily by resources that the household has to actually send their kid to pre-K? And that is, in fact, what's predicting kindergarten achievement. So we've talked about what education policy research is, what it looks like, the different forms and approaches that you can take to education policy research, the different types of data that are available, and we've talked about the importance of cause and effect with respect to identification of a policy's effect for its intended audience. Now, what I'd like to conclude with is an example that I think puts all of this information together, and an example of something that you could do as and support as an undergraduate researcher for an education policy faculty member like myself. If you remember the welcome video or the introduction video to researching with me and in education policy, you heard me talk about this example of the effect of serving breakfast after the bell, a school breakfast program, on school absenteeism. And I didn't reveal whether or not this type of breakfast program would indeed encourage better attendance for the students that it was implemented for. And so that's what we're going to talk about with the remaining time we have in today's talk. We're going to talk about this problem of getting kids to school and supporting them so that they have the same exposure to instructional time and educational resources as the students who are attending school. And think about breakfast after the bell as being one potential policy that schools, districts, and states may consider adopting to support student attendance. So the policy problem that we're trying to address is school absenteeism, right? Students not coming to school. And the reason that we are concerned that students are not showing up to school is not that they're simply going on vacations with parents and, getting caught up when they come back. It's that there's actually a pretty pervasive problem of chronic absenteeism across the United States. In policy, US policymakers have clearly demonstrated the recognition that we need to reduce absenteeism. And this is evident by one of the federal policies. So one of those policies that's enacted at the federal level, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is a reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, where 37 states plus the District of Columbia used chronic absenteeism as an indicator for school accountability. And all you need to know about that is that you've probably heard that test scores matter for schools and that they are held accountable for those test scores. What this policy did is it factored not only test scores into those accountability metrics, it also included a school's chronic absenteeism rate or their students' attendance into that, making that something that schools are then incentivized to encourage. Educationally, a lot of this policy actually came about because of researchers who found that absences negatively correlate with academic achievement, predict the likelihood that you were less likely to move on to the next grade or be retained in your current grade, and the likelihood that you actually finish high school. So In other words, what we realized is that absences actually predict a lot of other things that we care about: test scores, whether or not you graduate from high school. And there's even some research that traces absenteeism all the way into the labor market. And then also, what's interesting, I think at least, is that when I think about students missing school, I often think about, students skipping class in high school, right? But actually, absenteeism occurs across the grade span. The highest absences in elementary school, for example, are in fact in kindergarten. And so this is just to say that absenteeism is a problem in the US in terms of schools. And all of these sites, or these references, if you can see, are prior to COVID. So think about how after something like school closures, where students are now no longer used to going to school on a regular basis, might have the implications that that might have on regular attendance going behaviors. The fact is, schools are facing greater problems with students missing out now more than ever before. And when I was doing this study, there were also a lot of headlines about school breakfast programs and how these school breakfast programs might not only support student nutrition, right? Because if you're hungry in the middle of math class, you're probably not learning math as easily as you could if you were not hungry, right? And had a nutritious breakfast or a nutritious lunch. But also how these school breakfast programs might be a mechanism that could, one, encourage just overall better school behaviors, right? So students are just more engaged in class. They're less likely, to do poorly on an exam because their stomachs hurt. But also that this could be an incentive for students and their families to get students to school on time, right? Because if breakfast is served free or it is available, it could be something that a parent no longer has to make it home or wants their student to have a nutritious breakfast in the morning. And so they have that extra motivation to get their kid to school. And there's also some research that suggests that breakfast programs do likely have a relationship to absenteeism through a couple of different mechanisms, right? We know that going to school at the end of the day is a routine. You are used to getting up every morning and going to school, right? And so breakfast, just by nature of us being humans and we are hungry, right? Breakfast is part of our routine, right? And so if we can somehow link school going with breakfast, something that students want, then it might be a way that we develop a routine that may not already be there. So thinking about how routines have been disrupted because of COVID school closures, and those routines can then be re-solidified by providing free breakfast in the school. But we also know that there's other nutritional and family economic mechanisms that could relate to students then coming to school. So we know that malnourishment, students who just are hungry are less likely to come to school and certainly be less engaged in school. And we've seen that school breakfast programs themselves have been shown to improve this nutrition. And so it could be that this nutritional status and families' economic decision making, and they no longer have to pay for breakfast or provide the breakfast, could be that extra incentive that a household has both at the student level and the family level for ensuring that the student comes to school. And so this is where my research began. In thinking about a particular school breakfast program known as Breakfast After the Bell, which has two key pieces to it that makes it a really unique breakfast program. Because maybe at this point in the lecture, you're thinking, oh gosh, like a school cafeteria breakfast, like I'm not coming to school for that, right? Like that doesn't get me to school. But what if this breakfast program changed things up a little bit? What if breakfast isn't served early? You don't have to get to school super early just to eat your breakfast, but it's served as part of your first class period, right? So in elementary school, it could be as soon as your elementary student comes into the class. In high school, it could be in your first period. But the key is that breakfast is served as part of school. And then also, breakfast is not only served as part of the school day, but it is served in the classroom, right? Where you are able to begin your educational content and instruction while having breakfast. This is why this program was particularly interesting to me, someone who is interested in the policy problem of student absenteeism. And so, as part of education policy research, just like any research, as I'm sure you've heard about, you have these cool things known as research questions, right? So we take our interests and what we want to move the needle on, so to speak, with a particular policy or a decision at a particular level of governance, and we develop a research questions where we as the researchers step in to evaluate whether or not there is a relationship between these two things. So for this study, the research questions were, is breakfast after the bell implementation associated with chronic absenteeism? And is the implementation associated with chronic absenteeism after factoring in school breakfast participation rate? I will be focusing on the first research question for the remaining of the talk. So we talked about developing motivation, identifying a particular problem at different levels, right? And then we talked about data. And so for this study, this is what this data looked like. I used state administrative data from Colorado and Nevada. Each state kept logs of the number of meals that were served each month, the number of days the meals were served, the model, so we could tell what schools adopted breakfast after the bell and those who didn't. And we also had data from the civil rights data collection at the United States, the federal government level, which is collected to measure every school's and school district's rate of chronic absenteeism. And so I was able to link these two data sources together that are available in order to answer my research questions. Now, why Colorado and Nevada, you may be asking, and how were we able to actually tell whether or not breakfast after the bell had an effect? Well, these two states were chosen for a very specific reason. At the same time, in 2014, the state legislators passed legislation that required all schools with 70% or more students who qualified for free or reduced price lunch, which is a measure of income. So the household incomes that are below a certain amount qualify for free and reduced price lunch at the school. So in 2014, they passed a policy that said that if there are 70% or more of your students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, you had to adopt breakfast after the bell as a school breakfast program by the 2015-2016 school year. Now, there were a small proportion of schools that already had the breakfast after the bell program, and some schools failed to implement the program. Now, this happened in both states. Both states adopted this, that all schools had to adopt this program who met that 70% eligibility threshold by 2015-2016. And so what we're trying to do as the education researchers, right, is understand whether there was a positive or negative policy effect of adopting breakfast after the bell for the school and that school's chronic absenteeism rate. And there's a lot of methods that go into this. There's quantitative methods with known as regression equations. There's density tests. There's all sorts of things that factor into this. But at the end of the day, this stuff comes with time. We gain these tools as part of just being interested in understanding whether a policy or a decision has an effect in the real world. So we don't have to get caught up in this. Instead, what we can do is slowly make gains in, becoming more proficient with data management practices and improving our quantitative methods. But what you can do as education policy researchers at the undergraduate level is simply look at graphs like this and see that those schools who were required to adopt just barely, right, at that 70% threshold compared to this 69% threshold over here, I'm kind of fading into the background. You can see that there is a clear disconnect between those who were required to adopt breakfast after the bell and those who were not. On the y-axis, you see the chronic absenteeism rate for a particular school. And you can see that right at that 70% threshold, there is a clear disconnect or discontinuity between those who were really close to that eligibility threshold but weren't required to adopt it, and those who were just required to adopt it. They were just at that cutoff point. And that is one way that we can look at the potential effect that a policy would have by comparing schools who are very similar to each other. The only difference is they differ by 1 percentage point in the number of students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Now, like I said, there's a lot that goes into this type of analysis, but it's important for us to not forget that there are simple techniques that we can begin to develop at the undergraduate level to simply investigate whether or not we suspect that there could be a causal effect of a particular education policy, practice, or intervention. Now, this study, in terms of what education research winds up as, you may be curious, it doesn't just wind up in my filing cabinet. Actually, I don't have a filing cabinet. I don't think people use filing cabinets anymore, or I don't at least. It goes into a journal, right? And funny enough, this is what we spend all of our time doing. These are the most important things about being a professor, is getting your articles in the top journals of your field, right? But what inspired me to go into education policy research is what happens after this. And that is looking at all of the different stakeholders who become interested in this research. And I get to engage and have conversations with about the potential impact that this particular policy could have for historically disenfranchised populations nationwide. So as part of this research, I was able to not only do a report for our funder, which you may have heard of, No Kid Hungry, but I also was able to go on a podcast, write an op-ed for the Houston Chronicle, and have this information disseminated across the country. So that's what education policy research can look like. That's from my perspective, the lens that I bring to this work. But I'd like to know more about you. If it's helpful, go back to the EdNext poll and look at the different topics that the country is polled on every year by this organization. Charter schools, teacher pay, unions, and much more. What in education interests you? One of the things I love about education and education policy research is it touches everybody at some point in their lives. We all go to school in some form or another. So when you think about, do I want to participate in education policy research? Is this something that I think means a lot to me, interests me, feels like I can make an impact? The first step is to think about what interests you about this. What is interesting in education? Is it the way that you were taught by teachers? Is it the type of school you attended? Is it the resources and financial aid that's available to you at institutions of higher education, like here at Texas Tech? Think, what about education policy can you see yourself being interested in now and in the future? Thank you for watching this talk. It's very exciting to be able to introduce something that I find a lot of love and passion for, and I have the privilege to do as part of my daily life. I hope to see more of you in future lectures and talks, and potentially even working with you as an undergraduate research assistant down the road.